And welcome back to everybody to this episode of the Drive and Dish NBA podcast. My name is Kevin Rayfuse. Again, Justin off this week, but nevertheless, got a great guest. We are excited. Mr. Jake Fischer is here. Follow him on Twitter at Jake L. Fischer. You see his work at Bleacher Report. That's where he's doing the majority of his writing now, but you may know him from Sports Illustrated. I personally am excited because I've been reading Jake since Liberty Ballers. He's an ex-LB alumnus. For all of us, anyone who listens to the podcast knows that Justin and I are both Sixers fans. So just get all your groans out of the way as you're listening to this right now. Jake is a fellow processor as well. But besides, obviously, his writing, the main reason we're here to talk is his book has dropped, Built to Lose, How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever. So first, I just want to say congratulations, Jake. This is your first book. So, I bet that's got to be a great feeling. Getting that done, obviously having that weight off your shoulders a little bit. But, I guess first question as we get right into it is, obviously as a Sixers guy, I think we've talked process a lot. There's been plenty of litigations on process over the years, but this is way more than just the Sixers book because tanking is so much more than a process thing. I think, as we know, I think that just kind of brought it into the spotlight a little bit more. But, besides obviously being a Sixers fan and being attached with that, what really made you want to write this book and take this deeper dive into tanking? Because like I said, this is a 300+ page book. You're getting your money's worth with this here. So, what really was the inspiration and kind of the drive to get this thing going and this project going?
Well, like you mentioned, I started at LB and I was also at Slam at the time as an intern, and I was living in Boston and going to games at TD Garden. And, people forget that the Celtics traded KG and Paul Pierce to Brooklyn the same night that Hinkie traded Drew Holiday to New Orleans for Nolan's Noel, right? And then there was Rob Hennigan starting the rebuild in Orlando with that Dwight Howard trade, a year before Sam Hinkie ever got hired in Philly. Then you had Ryan McDonough in Phoenix. There were all these teams that were being driven by analytical-minded executives that were tanking for that 2014 draft. And it felt like being in Boston, covering the Sixers from a distance for LB, it definitely, and I felt like I was in the eye of the tanking hurricane, if you will. And whenever one of those other losing teams came through TD Garden, especially Philly, it felt like a tanking Super Bowl in a sense. And that game had big implications on the tankathon standings and all that type of stuff. So those conversations never really left. Whenever I would meet someone or talk to a player or coach executive throughout the rest of my reporting career, a lot of conversations always drifted back to that time period, especially knowing that I was from Philly and I was also making a lot of my early connections in the league through covering that team as well. So it felt like a great way to sum up all the reporting I've done over the last 8 years and further some more and make some more calls and form some new connections with other league people and create this book that, like I said, I've implied, I talked to over 300 people, and like you mentioned, it's got a ton of original new reporting that people won't find anywhere else. So that's kind of my pitch, and also the reason why I did it all together.
Well, and it's funny. So this podcast is going on 7+ years now, and we didn't start exactly in 2013, but really, for Justin and I, and when Tim Backwood, he was doing it as well. Tim being a Phoenix guy, but that for me, and you understand this, is that what I always tell people is that the Sixers made the finals in 2001 with Iverson. And while there was success in the years following, there was one playoff series win prior to 2012, the year after. And then they had the 2012 year where, of course, Derrick Rose blew out his ACL in the first round, and they had the 8-1 upset. But I think everyone knows realistically what that was, even with them taking Boston to 7 in that second round series. Largely, there was just that absence of joy, kind of just in that acceptance that you were going to be the 8 seed, the 7 seed every year. You were going to generally get into the first round. You might make some noise. You might have some moments, but for the largest part, you're going to flame out pretty quickly. I don't really think anyone thought there were title expectations for any of those Philly teams during the time. And so I think that's where, when Sam Hinkie got hired, everyone was able to there was a plan. Like, there was a plan to do something new. Even if you were going to swing for the fences and miss, you at least had that, kind of idea that you could believe in. One of your first conversations as you got your reporting career started was with the man himself, Mr. Sam Hinkie, who, I think for most people in Philly, for most people who followed this team, has been vindicated at least 4 or 5 times over. But talk about it. I think with a lot of Sam, there's still a lot of mystery. He's largely remained out of the spotlight, sans a couple of tweets since he's been, no longer affiliated with the Sixers. Obviously, he hasn't gotten another gig since then. But, just kind of peel back the curtain here a little bit. What was it like meeting Sam Hinkie? Because, you kind of, you kind of shot your shot a little bit too down in Orlando.
Yeah, like we mentioned at the top, I was an intern at Slam and in 2013, and then I met him down there very briefly. And when I went back down to Orlando Summer League in 2014, I really wanted to earnestly meet this guy and actually start cultivating a relationship with him. And a big reason why he didn't last in Philly was because he ended up not really speaking to the media and communicating his message to the fans and to the local media and the national media at large too. But he was very willing to talk off the record. And while that didn't satiate appetites of some people, for me, I thought it was a great opportunity to gain some insight into his knowledge. And, I do think that the strategy was, to build a perennial contender, like you're saying. I mean, there's very little value in terms of the NBA business model, like especially if there's two sides of the NBA business, right? There's tickets and whatever, and then there's winning the title. And the basketball operations, like if you're trying to win the championship, then like there's only one way to do that, and it's to create a roster that has multiple all-star players. And if you're not LA, if you're not New York, the most direct route to get those guys is through the draft. And maybe if you're like Miami, let's say, who drafts Dwayne Wade, you can pull multiple all-stars through free agency to join that all-star that you did draft, like LeBron and Chris Bosh. And coincidentally, that 2014 class that all these guys were tanking for, like I said, was considered to be the best class since 2003. It had Wiggins and Parker and Joel Embiid and Marcus Smart and Aaron Gordon and Julius Randle. And it was considered to be like a top 7. Like this year's class 21 is considered to be the best since 14, and it only really has a 5-player draft. But all those guys were so hyped back in the day. Wiggins was considered the next LeBron. Jabari was considered the next Carmelo. You go down the list. It was a loaded group. And Hinkie's goal was to create that perennial contender. He didn't want to just have a one-shot punch at winning it. He wanted to put his team in consideration to be around that title conversation for the better part of a decade. And I do think that they are there right now. They're starting to reach this next phase of the process, regime, if you will. The process, quote unquote, is over. Obviously, Sam's not there anymore, but as long as Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons are part of Philadelphia, I mean, his fingerprints are going to be indelible for what that team's success is moving forward.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's what it all comes down to. I mean, it's the treasure chest of assets that he accumulated that allowed them to get Ben Simmons and Joel, like you said, and have multiple swings. Even in the past, when, you trade for a Jimmy Butler, you make a trade for Tobias Harris, like all these other little moves that have come building to the team that, of course, we're getting to today. We'll flash back to a little bit. I got a question here. This is from Bill in Phoenixville, because I want to specifically stay on Sam for a second. But the question from him was, do you think Sam focused too much on the numbers and overlook the human side of it? Because that's, I guess, the part that we kind of look back on all the time. We know Sam is, of course, a very analytics approached guy. He was really especially when some of the guys you compared to earlier, like with Rob Hennigan and some of the other tenures specifically, he dove a lot harder into that than they did. But specifically for the example, like for Jahlil Okafor, I remember when the Sixers drafted Jahlil in 2015. There was, of course, that instant just kind of like what is going on. For example, with Nerlens Noel, it kind of felt like that got him checked out in Philly. And for a guy who was early in the process, kind of ended his tenure more than necessarily. As we look back on Sam, how much of a flaw do you think was that in his approach, or do you think it was a little overblown?
I think the numbers aspect, I mean, they definitely had metrics where, a certain like not third round, thinking in football terms. I'm doing a fantasy draft this week, a dynasty, and I'm like, it's consuming my whole, but down from 7 to 14, let's say, they had, future second round picks and whatever. And they definitely probably flew a little too close to the sun at certain situations. Like there's one detail in, I believe it was the 2014 draft, where they wanted Norman Powell. A big portion of the Sixers scouting department wanted to draft Norman Powell, and Philly took somebody else and just traded him right away to get a future 22nd anyway, or a future second round pick anyway. So there was definitely situations like that. But at the top of it, the big time guys, the Jahlil Okafor pick, from people I've talked to, from reporting I did for the book, it sounds like Joel Embiid's second foot break right before that 2015 draft. I remember exactly where I was. I was in a hotel. I forget which one it's called, but it was right across the street from Madison Square Garden. I was getting ready to go out with some friends on a Wednesday night, and sure enough, I get a Twitter alert that he's broken his foot for the second time. And I really think taking Ja was kind of a way to kind of band-aid over Joel, who might have been considered a bust at that time. Obviously it's kind of ludicrous to think about now, but flashback to 2015, this guy had broken his back to end his freshman year at Kansas. Then he breaks his foot in his pre-draft workout at Cleveland, which even made him available to Philly at number 2. I mean, I have it on the record in the book from multiple Cavs officials, from Bucks owner Mark Lazary, that both Cleveland and Milwaukee would have taken him at 1 and then at 2 if he was healthy. But so that's even how Embiid fell to 3. And a lot of the Sixers brass was starting to feel the pressure that ultimately did push Sam out, kicking the can down the road. Oh, it's a Ponzi scheme, all that type of, propaganda, if you will, that was coming out against Sam. I think that pressure and that noise was starting to get inside that front office. So they saw taking Jaleel as an opportunity to maybe get that center of the future, but also he had really high trade value too. And I think that's an essence of Sam's, or it was an essence of Sam's logic as well, where I remember, it's actually funny, I'm not a Sixers fan anymore. My brother makes fun of me for saying that. I think my fandom has bled into the Eagles more so, but I cover the NBA, and I think to do that fairly and honestly, you can't really have a rooting interest. And right now it'd be great if the Sixers won for my book, but honestly, if Milwaukee wins, it's an amazing story that Giannis is there and blah 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 blah. So I find intrigue in all of it, but I pinpoint the 2015 draft. I remember, for people who are Liberty Ballers fans, I was sitting next to Jake Pavorsky at Barclays Center. Number 3 pick comes up. They take Ja. And he was mortified, devastated. And I just shrugged and said, I mean, best player available. Like, he has the most trade value here, right? And that's the kind of the moment I knew I was trying. Maybe, honestly, Sam played a factor in my objectivity too, because I tried to think how he thought to try to understand the method behind his madness. And he really did try to detach emotion and just rely on numbers and your work and your data and your research over anything else. And I think that's kind of bled into my coverage too.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely interesting, like you said, because I mean, going back to 2014, I remember, I mean, we were locked in. It was going to be Andrew Wiggins. It was, like you said, I mean, obviously you've got it sourced on the record, but I think everyone knows that Joel was going 1. I mean, it's, given obviously what we know now, I think it's one of the more unfortunate breaks, no pun intended, in Philly history. I mean, having him slip like that, there's no chance he falls. Obviously, then with Milwaukee as well being in front of them, and with them ending up going with Jabari Parker, I think that, to me, like 2015, I'm kind of the same way. Like, that was the turning point, just because, like, I think they had felt the pressure a little more to win now. And like you said, with Embiid's second foot, there was still kind of that big question mark at the time. And so I understand the thinking. I just think it was more the shock of taking that many big men back to back to back, which of course is what the sticker shock was. At the same time, they ended up being so bad that it put them in position to get Ben Simmons. And so it's one of those things where it's like, it cost you Sam, at least you got Ben. But, unfortunately, I think the patience ran out there. Of course, with, like you said, the infamous Ponzi scheme articles and just all the talk shows and everything, like, it was toxic. There was no way around it. I mean, and for what it was worth, I mean, you know how it is. It was a miserable slog in 2015. Like, it's without a doubt one of the worst Sixers seasons I ever watched. Yeah. Again, the light at the tunnel was there with Ben Simmons, so at least you could say it paid off. But, flipping off Sixers a little bit, because that's the thing. And going back to the book, this is a way more of than just look at the process. The process inspired it. But, tanking is not just a Sixers thing. It's been really an NBA thing for quite a while. As you've kind of looked at these teams and you talk to general managers and scouts and college coaches and all these other people, one of the stats that I looked at this year specifically was that when Oklahoma City was just losing games at the end of the season, the one stat that I never quite could get over, and part of it is, again, probably as well the propaganda we heard, but that team had a worse net rating than any of the process Sixers did at any point, even when they were winning 10, 12 games. Like, that team was actively just doing nothing but playing young guys and losing, but you don't really hear the scrutiny there. And with other teams that have kind of done this as well, how do you think? I mean, obviously the Sixers, and maybe with Hinkie was his problem is that it was so brazen. But how do you think other franchises have kind of avoided getting the scrutiny when it just kind of becomes blatant at this point at the end of the season?
Yeah, I think, well, currently, a big criticism of the Sixers back then was from rival owners when that team would come into their stadium, right? No, they were having trouble selling tickets, and the noise around that team was so loud that 15-16 year, because they were approaching being the worst team of all time, let alone one of the worst Sixers seasons, right? That 2015-16 Sixers team, as they're approaching being the worst team ever, there's a lot of noise about that. It was getting louder than the Warriors, who were marching towards becoming the best team of all time. And that was really a problem for the league. And I think with flash forward to this year, particularly, like OKC sending these guys home for half the year. Same with Houston sitting down Terrence Ross, and the Pistons buying out Blake Griffin, and so on and so forth. One big factor, the pandemic obviously prevented a lot of fans from even being in the stands anyway. So that you can't sell tickets wasn't an issue. But also, Philly was a very large market, and they did it so brazenly and unforgivingly too, unapologetically, that it pissed a lot of people off, and that allowed for this conversation to happen and make the noise grow louder too. Like Sam Presti, I went to his virtual press conference last week. He spoke for 30 minutes to open his press conference and said, I'm here to hang out and talk as long as you guys want. Like, I don't know if that was influenced by Hinkie's process, but there was a direct opposite approach to what Sam did. Sam Hinkie, not Sam Presti. I think that it's a twofold thing. I think these teams right now, also the league created lottery reform in 2017 that came to play in 2019, the Zion draft, where, the Knicks tank all that year long to get Zion. They fall to 3, and everyone can say tanking is solved. You can't do it anymore. But there's still benefits to doing it. There's still, if you're the worst team in the league, you're still guaranteed a top 5 pick. And this is considered a 5-player draft, like we've talked about, right? Mm-hmm. So you flash forward, and the Rockets, they have the worst they have the worst record in the league. They're guaranteed one of those top 5 guys. That's why I think Tillman Fertitta comes out and tells ESPN how excited he is about the future. There's clear benefits to doing this, and even if the path to getting a number 1 pick isn't as direct anymore, like we've talked about throughout this, the value of getting one of those guys is just so high. A superstar in the NBA, as much as the NFL quarterback is considered to be the most important position in sports, it's not. Carson Wentz can't play defense, and then his Eagles defense loses the game for him when he goes off the field in his first rookie start, So that type of stuff happens all over the NFL, where you have LeBron, who can play both sides of the ball and dictate both sides of the court. And there's the reason LeBron's made the finals 9 out of the last 10 years is as much a testament to himself as it is that one player can have all that agency on the court. So I think tanking will be alive and well as long as people's draft position is dependent on their record.
Well, and that kind of leads into the next question, because, we're here in Orlando. And so, I think it's been, because they haven't had that true superstar talent in a while, it's tough to tell a franchise that has really been down since Dwight Howard left, for example. Since 2012, they made the playoffs 2 years, but they were an 8 seed both years. I think they won 1 game combined between those two. It's just one of those situations where, yeah, it's a little bit of a harder to sell to the fan base, but it kind of does fix all. If they get Cade Cunningham here, it immediately changes the entire outlook of that franchise. And that's, I think, why, you and I are in agreement. And I think most NBA fans who truly watch understand that you just, especially like you said, unless you're one of those premier markets, unless you're New York as they gain stability, unless you're LA, unless you're Miami, you're just going to have to work and do these situations right in order to get meetings with these top guys and put yourselves in the position to land them. But it's not impossible. Since 2013, you alluded to it earlier, the big changes, they've leveled out the top 3. So that if you're in the bottom 3 rankings, you have the same odds to get the number 1 overall pick. They've changed the odds down the board a little bit. Do you think, having taken now a massive look and an in-depth look at tanking across the league, is this a fixable problem for the league, or is this just something that they're always going to have to live with and that they shouldn't necessarily run from? Because I don't think it can create some bad basketball at the end of the year, but I think we saw with the play-in game, the last month this year in particular has been more competitive than it's been in a while. So I guess, is this a problem that the NBA even bothers fixing? Is it worth it?
So the play-in tournament is absolutely an invention to help sway teams away from tanking, just like the Kings end up trying to vie for the 10th spot like we saw this year. And they're going to institute a midseason tournament, I believe, in the next couple of years as well. I mean, I reported it for Bleacher Report on Monday that the G League is progressing towards finalizing a structure for the midseason tournament, where it actually wouldn't even be a midseason tournament in the G League. It's going to be a start of season tournament where you kind of break the calendar into two separate calendars, where you have this tournament and then your records reset to 0. I don't know if that's going to happen in the NBA, but if they do create a midseason tournament type thing that decreases the actual counting regular season games for the standings, which seems to be the structure that they're interested in, that alone will then shrink the sample size, right? Which will have it'll keep more teams being in contention for the playoffs longer. The longer the season goes, then 82, if it's only a 66 game season, let's say, with, a 20 game mid-season tournament type thing, those 66 games, it's a lot easier for every team. It's going to take, it'll be longer into that 66 game stretch when teams are eliminated from the playoffs. Let's say I probably explained that poorly, but anyone who understands math at a high school level will probably get what I'm saying. From there, I think that the only real way to eliminate tanking is you got to separate your draft positioning from your record. Now that's difficult because what happens to a team like Milwaukee, who when they only really in the picture for Jabari because all their players got hurt pretty much. They had a nightmare season 13-14. They're the Bucks. They're not getting a free agent guy, right? If they didn't have Giannis the year before, they would have been absolutely screwed because Jabari doesn't work out too. So how does a team like Milwaukee get better without the draft? If you don't want to have that fail-safe option, if you want to just encourage all teams across the board to just be trying to compete all the time, I think the only answer is the wheel type concept that Mike Zarin, the Celtics assistant general manager, pitched back in the day, which is in my book too. It was definitely being kicked around back in 2014 when lottery reform was first being discussed. And that would put every team in the league, the 30 teams, into buckets of either 5 or 6. And you'd still have lotteries. You just have 5 or 6 different lotteries every single year. And that group in that 1 through 5 bucket, let's say if this started in 2021, 2022, they would all move back to 26 through 30. And then 2023, they'd move up from 6 to 10. And then they'd go 20 through 25. And everyone would rotate around. And that way you're on a 5-year cycle. And you can, make your moves depending on where you're going to be picking in a couple of years from now. And that, separates your record and your performance that exact year to where you're going to be. And literally you have zero motivations and benefits to losing for draft purposes because there aren't any. But I think it's a very costly switch to do that for teams like Milwaukee or, if Russell Westbrook and Paul George decide to just leave your team and you're Oklahoma City, this is they got Chris Paul, but, Chris Paul is almost 40 and he's not going to be around forever. So I think doing that really takes away a tool for half your teams that need that draft to actually get better. So you're right. It is a problem. I think it's a huge conundrum that the league's going to be considering for, the next 2 decades.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, though, I mean, you know how it is with all problems. You just don't want the solution to be worse than the problem. The wheel idea, I remember, was interesting. Like you said, I think that kind of is the only one that even seems a little bit practical. But even then, there's still a lot of issues with it. I wish it wasn't this way. I wish there was a way where every single team could get the same type of free agency draws, free agency meetings, but it's just not the reality of it. So like you said, and once these small market teams, like we're at the point now, especially in the NBA, obviously, where you can market anywhere. Like you said, Russell Westbrook was in Oklahoma City for over a decade. He's a national household name. He had plenty of endorsement deals that he could get. Giannis is in Milwaukee. Everyone knows who he is at this point. So I think we moved past where you can't be a star in a small market, but being able to, you can draw guys in when you have that one guy, it becomes a lot easier then. But if not, you're just generally not going to get those meetings. Is it fair? No, it's not remotely fair, but unfortunately, that's just the way the reality is sometimes. I mean, even in Philly, I don't think Philly has the draw that a New York has, for example, and it's very close, but it's just the reality of the situation. I wish it wasn't that way, but hey, it kind of is what it is, and you don't want to make the solution worse. All right. Back to the process. Rapid fire real quick. Favorite process player. You sat down and you covered, obviously, I want to say this is like a 4 or 5 year period. You've seen all these guys, especially going back 2013 and 2014. I know there's that infamous shirt that's got all the names on it, like the 4 big columns of everybody, some of which have become quite good. Word to Jeremy Grant. But I guess looking at everybody from back, my go-to is Jakar Sampson. I just love the energy he brought. I love the point guard debates. Like it just, yeah, and that's what even the best part is like he stayed in the league through all this. He's made a decent career just bouncing around for teams. But who's that one guy I guess that will kind of always stick with you?
I'm really partial to TJ McConnell. Undrafted guy comes in the league, and reporting I had, he told me this. A lot of his teammates told me this. He would go up to guys after training camp every day and be like, "Hey, man, what do you think I have to do to make this team?" Like players, what do you think my chances are? Not coaches. And he's still to this. I mean, he's setting himself up in free agency this summer to sign, I think probably like a 3-year, $24 million deal, something like that. And that's a pretty awesome payday for a guy who most people didn't even give him a shot to make the end. I mean, I think he might make all second team defense this year. That's just he's been an amazing player. And the stories I was told from all those guys about how just he grinded and hustled and did everything he could to make his spot. And he's still acting like that, even though he's about to get paid, 20 plus million. And he's a really humble guy. He's always been really nice and welcoming whenever I walked up to him in the locker room. He's been someone that I'm a fan of, and as a player and a person, and I'm really happy for his success.
Yeah, I mean, he really is. I mean, when you just look at the ultimate success stories out of everybody, I mean, he's without a doubt one of them. I mean, I'm in the same boat as you. I was stunned when he made that roster. Like, I didn't think there was any chance. I remember even going back to Orlando Summer League, and he's pretty bad. He hustled. He did all the things you expected, but like, it was a far, far cry from what it became. And then obviously he got that folk hero status. A couple of big moments. The buzzer beater against the Knicks is the one I think everybody will always going back to. Between the mellow disdain and him running up and down and Joel tweeting him afterwards and
Joel grabbing his neck in that picture.
That's right. Yeah, I forgot him. It looked like his eyes were going to pop out. It looked like the Homer Bart strangle from back in the day. But shout out to TJ, of course. It's still killing it in Indy, almost breaking the NBA steals record. So going ahead to the Sixers this year. I mean, getting the number one, we've talked about it immensely, was so huge for this team, just for strictly bracket purposes. I mean, you can't have asked a better bracket to have broken for the Sixers, handling their business so far against Washington up 2-0, pretty convincing win last night. They're going to get the winner of this Hawks-Knicks series, the Hawks-Knicks series, which looks to be great. I mean, we've had two awesome games so far. The Garden's absolutely rocking. But that's one of those series you think could go 7 games, regardless who comes out. I feel like the Sixers have to be the favorite in that second round series. It would be just tremendous. I mean, to me, probably the worst case scenario if they were to end up getting bounced in that second round and just not making any progress against both of those teams. But when you look at the other side of the bracket already, you've got whoever comes out of that just insane, what looks to be Milwaukee pending and non-Miami comeback. And that Brooklyn matchup, Brooklyn is handling their business against Boston right now. It's too early to tell. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves because obviously Milwaukee's playing their best ball of the year right now, and Brooklyn is Brooklyn. I think that goes without saying with those 3 guys on the court. Do we want Milwaukee, I guess, more just based off the fact that they don't have that much firepower, or is this just one of these scenarios where the Sixers are going to have a hell of a go of it no matter what, so you kind of just got to strap in and deal with it?
Well, I definitely think they have the easiest path to the conference finals. Milwaukee and Brooklyn are going to beat the crap out of each other in the second round, but I think either Milwaukee and Brooklyn could still emerge and beat Philly too. It's those 3 teams at the top are really the only ones I have a real shot, I think, of making it out, and they all kind of have different things, right? I mean, the Bucks play their spread offense around Giannis. The Nets have their three guys, and the Sixers are defensive juggernaut with Embiid and shooting. So they've all kind of got different formulas, and I think the matchups in each one of those, Milwaukee, Brooklyn, Philly, Milwaukee, there's different cross matchups that are different levels of importance throughout them. I think what the Bucks did with Drew Holiday was obviously a very successful upgrade. Eric Bledsoe was just not getting it done for them anymore, and I mean, it's funny that George Hill is resurfaced in Philadelphia, but that was more of an Eric Bledsoe upgrade, and George Hill is now he's not really dependent to create in Philly. That's what the Bucks really needed. They needed somebody who could be an additional playmaker in the half court, and they have that in Drew Holiday. Obviously, Chris Middleton seems to be their on-ball creator, finisher guy, but Drew has been such a stud playing in pick and rolls. And, I talked to a lot of people in New Orleans before that trade, and they really thought that Drew only was kind of like an A-B decision maker in pick and roll. He would either go and score or throw the lob, and that was it. And now he seems to be much more dynamic and seeing the whole floor. I think Drew gives them, a real fighting shot against Brooklyn. Absolutely.
He's not a process guy, but I'll just always have that love for Drew. I mean, not just because he started it, but I mean, he was the lone bright spot, it felt like, for 3 years. Like, because they got him. I mean, that's what's crazy is he was so young when he got drafted. Like, I think people forget about that. He was like 18 years old, I still think, when he got drafted, even with the year of college at UCLA, just to see him blossom into this max guy. And I think there were a lot of eyebrows raised, of course, when, Milwaukee gave up that massive 4 first-rounder haul to get him. I also think it's one of those situations where it's the cost of doing business. You got to shake the thing up and you got to shake the roster up, and you kept Giannis, which is obviously, this year would have been a nightmare if they hadn't got that 5-year deal done with having that question loom. Now that's all out of the picture, of course. And, he's perfect for the playoffs. Like, Drew Holiday is just one of those players. I mean, the national audience, I think, kind of got it a couple of years ago when he had that series against Portland with Dame Lillard. Mm-hmm. But I mean, this is just the type of guy who you want in these late conference finals games. And I mean, like you said, just a massive upgrade over Eric Bledsoe. He does so much for this team.
Yeah, I think you hit two really interesting points. I think it goes back to our friend Sam Presti in OKC again. The offseason he designed with Russ and Paul George, he set the market for trading for superstars now. I mean, look back even to 2018, where Kawhi only got moved to Toronto for DeMar DeRozan, Jakob Poeltl, and a first-round pick. Now you can't get Drew Holiday without giving up 3 firsts. And I think it was a very similar situation with David Griffin, by all accounts, did a really good job of creating a bidding war for Drew. And with Milwaukee, it was, you need this guy to help keep Giannis. So you got to give us this. And that's where the NBA is. I think it also goes back to competing for championships where you need these multiple all-stars, like in the tanking conversation. If you can only get these guys 3 ways: by draft, trade, or free agency. And if they're that valuable, of course, these valuations are going to continue to skyrocket in the title conversation. We're now seeing a league where this is an arms race, and to get your guys, people know that you're willing to pay for it now.
Yeah, I mean, the teams that have had superstars, just like you said, they have way more leverage. It's rare. In the past, it felt like, I remember when Paul George left Indy, for example, and I thought they did a great job getting value back, but they, of course, had, the figurative gun to their head a lot more. Everyone knew he was going to leave at some point. And so you just had to kind of salvage for anything. I mean, that to me, not to totally go down a different path, but that's kind of what makes the James Harden return in Houston just so mind blowing. It's like, look at what he's already done to Brooklyn. He's made them almost this sort of invincible juggernaut on offense that everybody's afraid of. But it's the fact that, you just couldn't get that return. It doesn't matter how much he doesn't want to be in Houston. Everyone on earth knows how good James Harden is. And then, like you said, going back to Sam Presti, just setting the market, it's the cost of doing business sometimes. It's kind of what the Clippers had to deal with when, you had to get Paul George to lure Kawhi in and get him to sign that max contract. Going over to the West now and going over to the Clippers, of course, the biggest surprise, I said on last podcast that the Clippers were going to win in 5, which has aged real well. Certainly, I thought they would really cruise through this series. I thought this was a worse version of the Dallas team that they beat last year. Instead, they're down 2-0. I mean, it's hard to say it's a must-win in Game 3, but it sure feels like it. I mean, we know the 3-0 record, what that potentially looks like. It's basically over at that point. Obviously, this is going to be an absolute nightmare. I think it goes without saying if they end up losing in the first round, especially after the way last year went. But, when you look at the box score, if nothing else, in Game 2, you got 41 points out of Kawhi Leonard. Paul George has 28. He plays pretty well. So, I mean, just what is going wrong here? Because I'm still trying to, you got Luke Kennard playing 0 minutes. They spent $64 million on him. Yeah. It feels like they're missing a creator. That's been the biggest standout to me so far. But as you watch that series, what's really stood out to you? What do you think is failing for this team?
Well, the Luke Kennard thing, I think, stems from, they made that move hoping that he would be the secondary creator, kind of like Drew has been for Milwaukee. Not to that same degree. They didn't think he'd be Drew Holiday. They thought he could grow into that type of guy. I mean, he's still young. This was his first extension off of his rookie deal. Mm-hmm. He's just not that guy right now. He had certain flashes of it at the end of the regular season when they made that push to, they were up at 3 for a while before they fell down to 4, obviously somewhat intentionally, it seems like. But Rondo was their big trade deadline acquisition to kind of help that situation. And I just don't think they have enough people who, outside of Kawhi and Paul George, can actually get their own shot in the half court and be a threat. I mean, Philly theoretically, doesn't have that many guys either, but even like a Seth Curry on this Clippers team would have been huge. Even like a Dante DiVincenzo on this Clippers team would have been huge. Same with Landry Shamet or Bruce Brown. Like, obviously Kennard, they traded Shamet for Kennard. That money, they were hoping he'd be an outsized playmaker, and they just don't have that guy. So when Paul George or Kawhi sit, they only have one of them. And, at certain points too, Kawhi can only do so much at a time, right? Like, you can't give him the ball to go get his and create for 40 minutes in the playoffs. Like, you need some type of guy to take the baton, if you will. And they're missing. I mean, they could have probably thrown their hat in the ring to go after Kyle Lowry. They didn't do that. It seems like they're just that one more half court creator away from really being a team that can withstand a whole playoff run and the whole attention of another team, especially when their opponent is just blitzing them, connecting on three after three after three. This team, the Clippers, are built on the same level of shooting, and when the shots aren't falling, they just don't have enough creative guys on their half court, situations to overcompensate for that.
Yeah, and if they end up failing, and we'll see what happens in Game 3 and how the series goes on. I mean, there's certainly enough talent there where there's a way they could rip off 4 straight. But if they fail, it does get interesting. Like, I'm not a big buyer into one of the. I mean, obviously the rumors are already going that Kawhi could potentially leave. I'm not really buying too much into that. I think they've invested too much at this point. I think he has as well. Being an LA guy as well, I think that hometown, feeling will always kind of overrule it a lot of times. It will get interesting though, because that's the thing is they've obviously already spent a ton of draft capital, the legendary amount of haul that the picks that they got in Oklahoma City. So you do wonder where exactly they tweak to get better. They have a bunch of good players on that roster. I'm certainly not saying it's impossible, but that, of course, I mean, they immediately at that point jumped to number 1. It feels like they've been the anti-Milwaukee. I mean, these are the 2 teams who came in, I feel like, with the most pressure on them. Milwaukee came out. It feels like to me so far that they got those mental demons kind of flipped the switch when they won that close game 1 in overtime. And then they just went out and hit every single shot in Game 2. So just, beat the hell out of Miami in that game. But, sticking with the Clippers series, I guess looking back at Dallas, I mean, I don't know. I think it's clear to me now after one season they lost the Seth Curry trade. I feel like they would like him more than they like Jay Rich. I think KP has certainly been up and down at times. It does seem like he's starting to figure it out. Yeah, I mean, just the lateral movement just doesn't feel the same at all. And I mean, obviously been dealing with a lot of injuries, but defensively he hasn't been nearly the player you hoped he would be. But I mean, everyone knows how good Luka is, but have we underrated Dallas as a whole here, or have we just only focused on Luka too much? Has the rest of this core group got underrated? I mean, obviously Tim Hardaway is a really good piece there. He's having an excellent postseason so far, but I mean, it feels like we've all kind of been fast asleep at the wheel a little bit, no?
I think with Dallas, they had a lot of injury and COVID issues in the beginning of the year. I mean, they were down to 11th, and Kristaps he's been in and out of lineup all season, and the knee issue with the torn meniscus he sustained in the bubble, it doesn't seem like he's been able to bounce back fully from that. But Willie Cauley-Stein emerging as a real defensive, kind of Band-Aid. Like, he can sit back in that back line and compensate and make up for some other players' deficiencies. It's been a big role. And the shooting's kind of been there. Jalen Brunson came back healthy. Tim Hardaway Jr., got really, really hot. Kleba is just a stud, both sides of the ball. They're getting their contributions now from their guys that they needed to. I mean, Dorian Finney-Smith, I believe, hit 4 threes in that first game, and that's big contributions from your wing players that their one job really is to hit threes and defend. And when they're doing it, the Mavericks are very similarly constructed to how the Rockets were around James Harden, just with a little bit more size. And obviously, when that was going well, the Rockets made trip after trip to the conference finals. So who's to say Dallas can't get there this year? Maybe they're a little early, a little ahead of schedule. Maybe they're. I don't think they're in the same conversation as Phoenix and Utah and the Lakers when the Lakers were healthy and at full force. But I mean, Dallas could definitely give the Lakers a great run. Dallas could definitely give the Jazz a great run. I think they're a team that nobody wants to really face because Luka is just he's that good.
Yeah, he is that good. I mean, that's just what I all get down to. I mean, obviously, everyone's gone back and redrafted that a little bit, but just the fact that I mean, in my opinion, he's easily a top 10 player at this point. I know the preseason hype was insane. I mean, you had the early MVP favorites and just things like that along the way. So I think maybe there was that disappointment early on, but it's also like, no, the kid is that good. He's been that good for a while. He's going to be that good for a long time. I mean, Dallas has got one there. I mean, like we say, everyone. I hate making the comparison because it's such an unfair just bracket to put him in, but he's always going to get that Dirk comparison, and he has the potential to just be there the way Dirk did. Like, I think, we see it obviously now all the time in the NBA. A lot of these guys don't finish their careers in the same market. There's very few Kobe Bryants and Tim Duncans and Dirks anymore. It's just this kind of the way business goes sometimes. He's in that rare potential to kind of be there and stay in that Mavericks uniform for his entire career. You're listening to the Drive and Dish NBA podcast. I'm Kevin Rafuse. Follow me on Twitter at Rafuse to Lose. Jake Fischer is here. Follow him on Twitter at Jake L. Fisher. Of course, check out all his writing at Bleacher Report. Get the book, Built to Lose, How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever. Like you said, is well worth your money, 300 plus pages. And of course, any chance to, talk about the process, we're always going to promote one of those things. Jake, before we get out of here, we always like to end it on a good note. And of course, this was right in the intro. So, I mean, we talked about this a little bit before the episode, but it's always near and dear in my heart. Orlando Summer League, it doesn't exist anymore. I know the NBA is doing the thing with Vegas, and it's going really well. I mean, trying to turn it into a year-long event, it really has become like it's basketball Comic-Con essentially. Like the year we went to Vegas was absolutely incredible. You meet a bunch of awesome people. The players are in the mix as well because it's Vegas, so it's great times all around. But man, because we had done Orlando Summer League for I think it was 4 or 5 straight seasons, and it just was. Like, what do you miss the most about it? Because I mean, I'll get into mine in a little bit, but just I miss it so tremendously.
Yeah, I mean, as much as Vegas is a blast, and you can't beat the opportunity to sit down at a blackjack table with an executive or whatever. The cool thing about Orlando is that it was only open to the media, to teams, and to agents, and certain corporate sponsors. So anyone in that arena kind of sort of had to be there or had a reason to be there. And that eliminated all the crazy fans driving in from LA to watch the Lakers and all the fans showing up wearing their like random obscure late 1990s jerseys and whatnot, which is great. It's a really fun environment. I do get a kick out of it, and I'm energized by it in Vegas like I am every summer. I mean, when the dates got reported a couple weeks ago, like I immediately called my editor and was like, hey, let's get there. Like, it's important to be there to meet guys and whatever, but Orlando was just as much. I mean, there was this media room that everyone could eat in, and I remember sitting down at the table with Joshua Harris as like a 20-year-old intern, and bumped into Isaiah Thomas and had a whole conversation with him. That's a detail in the prologue of the book as well. It was just so cool to be in like this bubble of NBA important people before, not a pandemic bubble, but just like you could only get in there if you had a credential, and that was really cool. And it elevated you to have conversations with people that, I might not have had access to if I didn't go.
Yeah. I mean, just like you said, within the industry, other writers, players, I mean, it's the only place where you could stand up, and as you're looking, you see somebody's foot's along the baseline. You got to make sure you don't just trip over them and cause a scene, and you look over and you go, oh, hey, it's Kevin Durant here. He's supporting the young OKC guys. He wants to see what Cameron Payne looks like after his foot injury. And so he's there to chill out. Patrick Ewing is coaching the Hornets, and you can hear the play calls, and you can just hear these guys, I mean, it was the peak intimacy, and that's just the thing that I miss the most. Like you said, the common person isn't getting in there. But, I mean, the first year I went, same deal as you. I think I was 23 years old or something like that. And there's just there's something about that being in the building and just that feeling where, you got a reason to be there. And it's certainly an experience unlike any other. And, you can see some of these guys who end up, I remember Bam Adebayo, for example, was awesome in Orlando Summer League. He just had a great year, whatever. I think it was whatever year that was, 2016 or 2017. And it was just like, it was immediately where you could go back and be like, I think this kid's going to be pretty good. He's not getting a lot of hype, but he's there. I definitely miss it for sure. I selfishly, in a way, hope they bring it back. But I was very, I knew the process, but I'm not going to lie. When I opened up the prologue and then saw an Orlando Summer League tail right away, I was immediately like, oh yeah, we got to get Jake on the podcast. We got to talk about this.
Thank you.
There's too many great things there. Again, follow Jake on Twitter at Jake L. Fischer. Get the book Built to Lose: How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever. And, we'll see what happens. Hopefully, you may have to get that epilogue going if the Sixers mess around and win a title this year. So we may have to stand by for the deluxe edition.
For sure, yeah. And you can get it anywhere books are sold: Amazon, bookshop.org, my publisher Triumph Books, Barnes & Noble. And I've got this partnership going with this watch company called La Terrain, Turaine. With every watch sold, you get a free book. So if you want to it's got some great watches for like $100 that are really nice, and that's a nice little last plug for your listeners there.
Yeah, there we go. I say get a watch and listen and hear about Sam Hinkie. I mean, what else is there to do? I mean, it's just a beautiful combination. Again, thank you, Jake, for coming on. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of the Driving Dish NBA podcast. Find us everywhere you can listen to a podcast. Leave us a review on iTunes. Good or bad, or read them on the show. Watch the podcast on YouTube if you want to see Jake and I sitting in studios and just chatting back and forth for an hour.